When I saw my husband leafing through my phone, my heart skipped a beat, but not out of fear of getting caught. It was because of what he might find. The messages I had forgotten to delete. I tried to grab the phone from his hands, but he swiftly pulled it back and continued reading. I watched his face as it shifted, reading line after line, and I could feel my world collapsing in those fleeting seconds. Yes, now he was about to find out the truth. But not the whole truth. His hands trembled as he flipped further through the screen, and I knew right now, he was about to reach that one message, the one that would ruin everything. The one that would either clarify everything or twist it even more. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in his hands, and a new notification appeared on the screen. I saw his face drain of color as he read the sender's name. My husband froze. He didn't even blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, an old habit when I was nervous. My nerves tangled with the horrifying realization of what I had done. His breathing quickened. I could hear it even from the 2 meters that separated us. It was exactly what I had feared the most. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake, the mistake that changed everything forever. And now, I didn't know what to do. But let me tell you how it all happened. Before I share with you the secret I have so carefully kept hidden for so long, please let me know in the comments where you're watching this from, and answer this question. Have you ever had a secret you tried so hard to keep, but eventually, it was impossible? I had been married to him for over 25 years. We weren't a young couple anymore, but that wasn't the problem. No, we weren't in that honeymoon phase anymore, but that too shouldn't have been an issue. It's not as if we never had moments of joy or warmth. Yet, if you were to ask me about my marriage, the first thing that would come to mind was not love, not affection, but a profound sense of being invisible. To him, I was a piece of furniture, something essential but overlooked, something that had lost its shine long ago. I had always been the one who held everything together, the one who ensured the house ran smoothly, the one who took care of the children, even now when they were grown. But somewhere along the way, I had forgotten to take care of myself. It was strange, you know, how you could live with someone for decades and still feel like you didn't know them. Like a house you've lived in for years, the walls seem familiar, but you can't really say you've explored every room. I began to think that maybe he didn't know me anymore either, not truly. His eyes would glance over me, always busy with something. The way he looked at me, there was nothing there. And it wasn't that I expected him to constantly notice me, to always be enamored with me. But once upon a time, there was a spark. A flicker of something more. That spark had long since faded into routine. I knew my body had changed. I wasn't the young woman he had married. I had lived through childbirth, I had gotten older, my skin sagged a little, and my body had shifted in ways that I sometimes resented. But why did I feel like I was no longer desirable to him? I had tried to convince myself that it didn't matter, that it was all superficial. I had made peace with it, or at least I tried to. But deep down, I was desperate for some sign that he still saw me, that I still mattered in his eyes. That my presence in this house meant something more than just a warm meal and clean laundry. I didn't mind doing these things for him, for our family. But at the end of the day, when the house grew quiet and the lights went down, I was left with a strange feeling of emptiness. No one needed me in the way I craved. No one looked at me the way I wanted to be looked at. When he told me that his cousin, Noah, was coming to stay for a while, I was, frankly, indifferent. He had always been a part of our lives, a few family gatherings, a couple of shared meals, but we never had a real connection. I didn't expect much from Noah's visit, just another face in the crowd, another person in the house. But when I first saw him, standing at the door with a casual grin and eyes that seemed to scan everything around him with an unexpected warmth, something inside me shifted. It wasn't just that he was different. It was that he noticed me. Really noticed me. For the first time in ages, someone was paying attention to me, and it was like the air around me shifted. It was as though someone had opened a window I had forgotten existed, and I could breathe again. I wasn't blind to the way he looked at me, the way his gaze lingered just a second too long when I spoke, the way he seemed to make an effort to sit next to me, always finding some excuse to share a meal or walk through the garden with me. It was innocent at first, or so I told myself. Just a few shared glances, some polite conversation that stretched a little longer than necessary. But each time he looked at me, I felt something stir within me. Something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Something I had forgotten existed. And yet, every time I caught myself smiling or laughing a little too brightly when he spoke, I hated myself. I felt guilty, as if I was betraying something, or someone, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. Yet every time Noah entered the room, there was a pull I couldn't deny. I didn't want to feel this way. I didn't want to be someone who wanted something she shouldn't. But it was there. And it wasn't going away. At night, when I lay in bed next to my husband, I would listen to his slow, steady breathing, but all I could think of was the way Noah's smile had made me feel alive, the way his laugh had been like music after years of silence. It was so wrong. I knew that. But in those moments, all I could do was close my eyes and wish for something to change. To feel more than the routine of my life. I tried to push those thoughts away. I told myself it was just the loneliness, just the lack of connection with my husband that had me thinking like this. I told myself that this, whatever this was, would pass. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. I couldn't unfeel what had already started. I couldn't erase the feeling of being seen when Noah looked at me. And somewhere deep inside, I didn't want to. It all started so innocently. A few smiles, a compliment here and there. It was nothing more than that, or so I thought. But then, one evening, as we all sat together after dinner, Noah said something that caught me off guard. He looked at me with those eyes, those intense eyes that seemed to see straight through me, and he said, "You've always had this quiet strength about you. I admire that." His words hung in the air, and I felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through me. It wasn't the kind of admiration that I was used to, not from my husband, not from anyone. It was something different. Something that made me feel noticed. I tried to laugh it off, to make it seem like it was no big deal. But inside, something was shifting, something I couldn't control. I wasn't sure if it was desire or something else entirely, but it didn't matter. The truth was, I hadn't felt that alive in so long. And I hated myself for it. But maybe I didn't hate it as much as I should. It started with a simple touch. I didn't even realize how much it would change everything. At first, it seemed harmless, even innocent. But those small moments, those accidental brushes against my arm, the way he would glance at me a little longer than necessary, began to build up, one after another, until I could no longer ignore them. It was the kind of thing you try to rationalize. I told myself, he's just being polite, or he's just friendly, that's all. But it wasn't just that. There was a weight to it, something unspoken that hung in the air between us. And I was painfully aware of it, even as I tried to dismiss it. I had never expected this from Noah. Sure, he had always been pleasant, charming even, but he had never been this present. It wasn't just that he looked at me, it was the way he listened, the way he hung on every word I said, as if my thoughts mattered to him more than anyone else's. It was something I hadn't felt in years, not from my husband, not from anyone. It was as if he saw me, not just as the wife or mother or housekeeper, but as a person. A woman. I didn't know how to handle it. I wasn't some naive girl who didn't understand the implications of what was happening, but a part of me couldn't help but enjoy the attention. I'd long since convinced myself that those desires I once had were buried beneath layers of duty and time. But Noah's presence made them resurface, raw and undeniable. The evening after he made that remark, the one that made me feel seen, I tried to push it out of my mind. I told myself it was just a passing moment, that I shouldn't read too much into it. I even told myself that maybe it was my own fault, that I was letting myself be too sensitive, too vulnerable. But when I walked into the living room later that night, I saw him there, sitting on the couch alone, his eyes flicking to me as I entered the room. It was a small thing, a glance, but it felt like an anchor being thrown into my chest. He smiled at me, that same knowing smile. A smile that felt more intimate than anything I'd seen in years. It was the kind of smile that said there was something between us, something unspoken, something I didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't ignore. I looked away quickly, my heart beating a little faster than it should have, and tried to push the thought out of my mind. But it lingered. Later, after dinner, my husband retired to bed early, as he often did these days. I couldn't remember the last time he stayed up late to talk, to engage with me in any way that felt personal. He had retreated into his own world, and I had become a passive observer. Noah, on the other hand, remained in the living room, flipping through a magazine absent-mindedly. I noticed him glancing up at me every now and then, but his eyes weren't distant, as my husband's often were. They were focused, intent, as if there was something he wanted to say but wasn't sure how to say it. I sat down on the opposite side of the room, my mind racing. Should I be angry? Should I feel guilty? The guilt weighed heavily on me, but at the same time, there was something else, something more complicated. Desire. Longing. I hadn't realized how much I missed feeling wanted until now. I hadn't realized how starved I had been for something that was just mine. Noah seemed to sense my discomfort. He didn't say anything, but he leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving mine. And in that moment, I felt exposed, like he could see right through me, like he knew exactly what I was feeling. It was disorienting, this connection we were building, as if it had always been there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged. The tension in the room grew palpable, and I could feel the walls closing in around me. I knew I should leave, retreat to the safety of my own bed, where the routine of my life would be waiting for me. But I didn't move. Instead, I stayed there, frozen, caught between the pull of something new and the weight of my responsibilities, my commitments. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, none of them clear, none of them simple. And then, without warning, Noah stood up. He walked over to where I was sitting, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I thought he might leave, return to his room. But he didn't. Instead, he reached out, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and placed his hand gently on the back of my chair. It was just a touch. A simple gesture. But it sent a shiver through me, one I couldn't explain, one I couldn't control. His hand stayed there for a moment longer than necessary, and I could feel the warmth of his fingers through the fabric of my shirt. I felt a pulse of heat surge through my body, and for the first time in years, I was aware of every inch of myself, of every nerve, every part of me that had been dormant for so long. I didn't pull away. I didn't say anything. Instead, I just sat there, staring straight ahead, my breath catching in my throat. It was a strange feeling, one that I hadn't experienced in so long, and it terrified me. But at the same time, it felt strangely liberating. To be touched, to be acknowledged, to be wanted. Noah didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence between us was heavy with unspoken words, with the tension that had been building since he arrived. And then, as if he had read my thoughts, he pulled his hand away and walked quietly to the door. "Good night," he said, his voice low, almost like a whisper. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was too busy reeling, too caught up in the weight of what had just happened. He had left, but his presence lingered in the room, in the air, in my thoughts. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, just sitting in the silence, trying to make sense of everything. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Something had changed. When I finally made my way to bed, I found myself lying there, staring at the ceiling, wide awake. I could hear my husband's steady breathing from the other side of the room, but it felt distant, like we were strangers living under the same roof. I thought of Noah's touch, of the way his eyes had lingered on me, of the way I had felt seen for the first time in so long. I tried to push the thoughts away, but they wouldn't leave. I tried to close my eyes and pretend it didn't matter, but it did. And I knew it. In that moment, I realized something. I wasn't just looking for attention. I wasn't just looking for someone to notice me. I was looking for a way out of the monotony, out of the life I had built, a way to feel alive again. And Noah, whether he knew it or not, had given me a glimpse of that. But at what cost? I didn't have the answers. I didn't know what would happen next. But one thing was clear, I couldn't go back. Not now. And as I drifted into an uneasy sleep, I knew that this was only the beginning. The days that followed were a blur, a strange mix of routine and underlying tension. It was as though the world had shifted just slightly, enough that I could feel it, but no one else seemed to notice. I tried to go on with my usual tasks, cooking, cleaning, checking in with the kids, but all I could think about was the night before, Noah's touch, the way he had looked at me. It was as though everything had suddenly become vivid, as if a veil had been lifted, revealing all the things I had ignored or buried deep down for years. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting, that this was just a brief moment of attention that didn't mean anything. But every time I looked at Noah, there was that same intensity in his gaze. It was like he knew, and maybe I knew too, that something was happening between us. Something I couldn't control, something that didn't fit neatly into the life I had built for myself. And yet, despite the anxiety that gnawed at me, a part of me couldn't help but feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. Every glance from him, every smile, every fleeting touch seemed to spark something inside me. Something that had been dormant, locked away for so long. But I had to keep it together, I told myself. I had to keep my composure, for the sake of my family, for the sake of my marriage. I couldn't let myself be swept up in this, whatever this was. I couldn't let it ruin everything I had. It wasn't easy. The more time I spent around Noah, the harder it became to ignore the way he made me feel. There was a rawness to his presence, a sharpness that cut through the numbness I had grown so accustomed to. It was like he could see right through me, see the parts of me I had long ago pushed aside. One evening, after dinner, my husband decided to take a walk. It was a warm night, the kind that made everything feel calm and quiet, and he suggested I join him. But as soon as he said it, I knew I couldn't. Not with Noah there, not with the lingering tension between us. I think I'll stay in tonight, I said, forcing a smile. You go ahead. He didn't seem to notice anything unusual. He just nodded and went out, leaving me alone in the house with Noah. I felt a surge of guilt as soon as the door closed behind him. I wasn't doing anything wrong, not really, but it felt like I was walking a tightrope, constantly teetering between what was acceptable and what wasn't. And here I was, with Noah, alone in the house. My thoughts raced, trying to keep a grip on what was happening, but it was becoming harder to maintain any semblance of control. I sat on the couch, trying to focus on a book, but my mind kept drifting. Noah was in the kitchen, moving around quietly. I heard the clink of glasses, the hum of the refrigerator, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. It wasn't a thought, really, more of a sensation, like the air had thickened, like something had shifted just out of reach. When he came into the living room, carrying 2 glasses of wine, my heart skipped a beat. It wasn't unusual for us to share a drink, but tonight, everything felt different. He handed me a glass, and our fingers brushed as I took it from him. The contact was brief, but it lingered in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. I forced myself to take a sip of the wine, hoping it would calm my nerves, but it didn't help. The silence between us was thick, filled with unspoken words, unacknowledged feelings. I could feel his gaze on me, just like it had been the night before. But now it was even stronger, more insistent, as if he was waiting for me to say something, to acknowledge what had happened. But I couldn't. I couldn't admit to myself what was going on, let alone say it aloud. So I just sat there, trying to focus on the glass in my hand, trying to pretend that nothing had changed. He sat down next to me, a little too close, and I felt the tension in my chest tighten. I should have moved, should have created some distance between us, but I didn't. It was as if I couldn't bring myself to do it. And in that moment, I realized something I didn't want to. Noah leaned back, and for a moment, we were silent, both of us trapped in our own thoughts. Then he spoke, his voice low and almost hesitant. "Do you ever feel like you're just stuck?" he asked. "Like you're just going through the motions, and nothing ever changes?" I looked at him, surprised by the question. It felt too personal, too intimate, but there was something about his eyes, something in his tone, that made me want to answer honestly. "I don't know," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think I've gotten used to it. To the routine. The stability. But sometimes, yeah, I do feel like I'm just here. Not really living, just existing." He nodded slowly, his eyes searching mine. "I get it. I really do." The words hung in the air between us, and I felt something stir deep inside me. It wasn't just sympathy. It was something else, something unspoken that neither of us was willing to put into words. But in that moment, I knew he understood. And I hated how much I needed that understanding, how much I craved it. I took another sip of wine, trying to steady my shaking hands, but it didn't help. I couldn't stop thinking about the way he looked at me, the way he made me feel. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't going to stop. It couldn't. Not now. Noah shifted slightly, his knee brushing against mine, and the contact sent a jolt of electricity through my body. It wasn't a sexual thing, not exactly, but it was a reminder of what I had been missing, what I had been longing for. And it was dangerous, so dangerous, because I couldn't just ignore it. I couldn't just turn it off. I felt his presence more acutely now, felt the way the air between us had thickened, felt the tension that was building, as if we were both holding our breath, waiting for something to happen. He didn't say anything more, but he didn't need to. The silence between us was enough. It was more than enough. I should have stood up, should have left, should have found a way to escape. But I didn't. I stayed there, sitting on the couch, with him beside me, the distance between us closing in. And in that moment, I realized something else. I was no longer sure I wanted to escape. The next morning, everything looked the same. The sunlight filtered through the kitchen window in the usual quiet way, casting gentle shadows on the wooden floor. The coffee pot gurgled just like it always did, and the smell of toast lingered in the air as it always had. But something inside me had shifted. It wasn't just a thought or a fleeting feeling anymore, it was a presence. Something constant. Something unsettling and undeniable. I moved through the kitchen slowly, as if trying to delay the day from truly beginning. My husband sat at the table, immersed in his newspaper, occasionally sipping from his cup, not looking up once as I passed behind him. There had been a time when he would reach for my hand, even as he read, or make a quiet comment about the headlines, just to pull me into his world. That version of him hadn't existed in years, and somehow, I had stopped expecting it. Noah entered the kitchen a few minutes later, his steps light, casual. He greeted us both in his usual friendly tone. My husband responded without lifting his eyes. I just nodded. I didn't trust myself to speak. Not yet. As Noah poured himself some coffee, he glanced over at me, only for a moment, but it was enough. I felt my breath catch, just briefly. My stomach tightened in that now familiar way, and I looked down quickly, focusing on the toast I hadn't even taken a bite of. I kept wondering if I was imagining all of this. Maybe the moments we shared, the silences filled with something more than politeness, maybe they were only significant to me. Maybe I was projecting emotions where there were none. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Noah's eyes had told me what words hadn't. His silences were heavy with things unsaid, and mine mirrored them too well to be coincidence. The day passed slowly, a blur of small tasks and internal distractions. I folded laundry, watered the plants, sorted through old mail. All the while, my thoughts wandered, circling the same point over and over, what now? I had done nothing wrong, not truly. But I had crossed some invisible threshold, and I couldn't go back to not knowing how it felt to be noticed again. In the late afternoon, my husband announced he would be heading into town for a few hours to run some errands. His voice was neutral, as always, his face unreadable. He asked if we needed anything and I said no. Noah stood behind him, near the hallway, and neither of them looked at each other. There was a quietness in the room that I hadn't noticed before, a pause in the rhythm of everything. When the front door closed behind my husband, that pause deepened. I found myself in the garden, kneeling near the rose bushes I had planted years ago. They had always been temperamental, too much sun and they withered, too much shade and they wouldn't bloom. I admired their resilience nonetheless. Noah appeared beside me after a few minutes. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, watching, hands in his pockets. Eventually, he crouched down next to me, close enough that I could sense his presence without needing to look. There was something in the air between us that felt too big for words. "You always come out here when you need space," he said quietly. I paused, my hand still holding a small trowel. His observation caught me off guard, not because it was incorrect, but because I hadn't realized he had noticed. "I suppose I do," I replied, keeping my eyes on the soil. "The garden listens better than most people." He chuckled softly, and then we were quiet again. There were moments like these that made it impossible to ignore how far things had gone, not physically, but emotionally. The way he spoke to me, the way he noticed things, the way he looked at me, it wasn't casual, and it hadn't been for a while. And I knew my part in it, knew I hadn't shut the door when I could have, should have. He reached out then, brushing some dirt off my forearm, a gentle, brief touch. It was the most ordinary of gestures, but it didn't feel ordinary at all. It felt intimate, deliberate, filled with meaning. I froze, unsure of what to do or say. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, withdrawing his hand. "I shouldn't have." I shook my head. "It's not that." But I didn't finish the thought. What could I say? That it scared me how much I wanted him to keep touching me? That I had spent so long pretending I didn't need affection that now, having even a little, felt overwhelming? That I hated myself for being caught in this emotional limbo? He sat back on the grass beside me, not too close, but not distant either. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he said. I nodded. "I know." And it was true. Nothing had been planned, nothing had been pursued. It had just happened, slowly, quietly, subtly. 1,000 tiny choices, 1,000 little moments, and now we were here, in the garden, with more between us than either of us had anticipated. After a while, he stood up and left me there with the roses. I stayed until the sun began to set, the sky streaked with amber and rose and soft lavender. When I finally went inside, the house was quiet. My husband still wasn't back, and I moved through the rooms as if they weren't mine. Dinner was a quiet affair. My husband returned later than expected, tired from the errands and traffic. He didn't ask about my day, and I didn't offer any details. We existed in parallel, two lives running side by side without ever touching. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours. My thoughts were too loud, my body too restless. The silence between my husband and me was becoming unbearable, not because of anything we said, but because of all the things we didn't. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I didn't know how to navigate the space I was in. I hadn't meant to fall into this. I hadn't meant to feel anything for Noah. But feelings aren't always neat and controllable. They creep in through the cracks when you're not looking, when you're vulnerable, when you're lonely. And the worst part was, I wasn't even sure I wanted it to stop. I missed being looked at with interest. I missed being heard. I missed being seen not as a fixture in someone's life, but as a person with her own desires, her own needs. And now, I had tasted that again. Just a glimpse. But it was enough to change everything. I turned to look at my husband, already asleep, his breathing slow and steady. I watched him for a long moment, searching his face for something I no longer recognized. He had been my partner for so many years, and yet, here we were, strangers in the same bed. I closed my eyes and tried to silence the thoughts in my head. But they didn't leave me. They clung to me, whispering things I didn't want to hear, truths I wasn't ready to face. And deep down, I knew this was only going to get harder. The days moved forward, each one blending into the next, as though time had taken on the rhythm of a clock that ticked just slightly out of sync. Nothing had happened in the traditional sense, no declarations, no crossed lines. And yet, everything had changed. Inside me, something was shifting, turning, awakening. It was as though I was watching my life through a glass pane, pressing my hands to the surface but unable to touch it anymore. I was there, but no longer part of it. I tried to be present, in the kitchen, in conversations, in daily routines. I tried to return to the version of myself who could ignore the ache of being unseen. But every time I looked at Noah, I felt like a fraud. I could feel the moments thickening between us, pressing in, becoming harder to ignore. Then came the drive. It was a casual suggestion. My husband had a morning appointment that would take most of the day, and Noah asked if I wanted to go with him to visit a nearby farmer's market. Just a drive, he had said, holding up the car keys, offering a smile that felt easy, unforced. I hesitated. I knew what saying yes might mean. But I also knew I would say yes the moment he asked. I told myself it was innocent. Just a market. Just company. Just an excuse to get out of the house. We drove in silence at first, the road winding through patches of farmland and open sky. The radio played quietly, some old song I half remembered, and I watched the landscape blur through the window. I didn't know what to say. My heart felt too close to my throat, my thoughts too cluttered to shape into words. The longer we drove, the more I became aware of how deeply alone we were. Just the two of us, no witnesses, no boundaries. He eventually spoke, commenting on the shape of the clouds or the smell of the late summer air, I can't remember. His voice filled the space gently, like a soft cloth laid over something sharp. I nodded along, occasionally responding, though I couldn't have said what I was agreeing to. At the market, we walked through rows of local vendors, baskets of tomatoes, peaches, hand-carved wood items, homemade candles. I picked up a jar of honey, holding it in my hands longer than necessary, staring into the thick amber swirl, as though it might offer me clarity. It didn't. He watched me. I could feel it. But he didn't move closer, didn't reach out. We walked together, speaking in low tones, sometimes falling into quiet again. It wasn't awkward, but it was charged. As though both of us were walking on the edge of something neither of us wanted to name. On the way back, the silence between us changed. It wasn't just quiet. It was something else entirely, fuller, more dangerous. The sun was setting, casting golden light across the dashboard. We didn't play music this time. The hum of the tires on the road filled the car, and every few seconds, I thought I would say something, ask him to pull over, or to drive faster, or to just speak anything, but the words didn't come. Then he pulled into a rest stop. It was small, just a gravel lot with a picnic table and a row of trees lining the edge of a clearing. I turned to him, confused, but he didn't look at me right away. "I thought you might want to stretch your legs," he said finally, not quite meeting my eyes. I nodded, and we got out of the car. We stood a few feet apart at first. I looked up at the sky, where the first traces of twilight were beginning to show, and tried to pretend this was just a normal stop, part of a normal day. But my hands were trembling, and I knew he saw. Then he stepped closer. It wasn't sudden. There was no dramatic movement, no sweeping gesture. Just one quiet step. He reached for my hand, hesitated, and then let it fall back to his side. "I don't want to make things harder for you," he said. I looked at him, then really looked at him. His face was open, vulnerable in a way that made something inside me twist. I wasn't imagining it. None of this had been one-sided. But I couldn't say what I was feeling, because to name it would make it real. "I know," I said softly. And then, without planning it, without fully understanding why or how or what it would mean, we kissed. We kissed. That was all. No words followed. No rush of explanation or apology. Just the sound of the wind in the trees, the steady beat of my heart in my ears, and the weight of everything that moment carried. When we pulled away, there was a silence that felt both full and empty. He stepped back. I turned toward the car. We didn't speak on the drive home. Not because there was anger or confusion, but because the silence said more than either of us could. I watched the road ahead, my fingers clasped tightly in my lap. My reflection flickered in the passenger window, a woman I barely recognized. By the time we reached the driveway, the sun had disappeared, and the house sat in shadow. My husband's car was there. He was home. The world had not stopped turning. Nothing had exploded. No one had seen. But everything had changed. Inside, the lights were on, the television hummed softly from the living room. My husband called out a brief greeting from his chair. I responded, my voice steady. Noah passed behind me, heading toward the guest room, his steps quiet but deliberate. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, my hand shaking as I lifted it to my lips. My reflection in the darkened window stared back at me, unreadable. And then I stood there, unmoving, for a long time. There had been no plan. No decision. But now there would have to be one. I had opened something I couldn't close. I had stepped over a line that could not be erased. And all I could think was, what now? It didn't take long for the weight of what had happened to settle in. The kiss, brief, quiet, yet loud in its consequences, played over and over in my mind like a film reel stuck on a single frame. The memory wasn't even clear, not in the way moments are sometimes recalled with vivid colors or precise sensations. It was more like a pulse, a jolt I kept feeling whenever I let my thoughts wander for too long. I couldn't undo it. I couldn't unfeel what I had felt. The worst part wasn't the guilt. It was the calm. I had expected to be consumed by panic, to be paralyzed by remorse, to not be able to look at my husband. But instead, everything continued as before. I folded towels. I made dinner. I laughed when my son called. I smiled when my husband brought me tea after dinner. I moved through the house like a woman I didn't recognize, capable, careful, composed. And yet, inside, everything was a storm. My thoughts were not still, even if my body moved with practiced precision. I was always watching, myself, him, Noah, all of us, like chess pieces suspended mid-move. No one else knew what had shifted, but I could feel it with every breath. The next morning brought with it a quiet so sharp it bordered on discomfort. I couldn't help but scan the room for signs that my husband suspected something, signs that Noah might act differently. But everything looked the same. My husband sat at the table, buttering his toast, reading the paper. Noah joined a few minutes later, pouring his coffee with the same ease he always did. He glanced at me only once, and if I hadn't been watching so closely, I might have missed it. But I saw it, a flicker of tension behind his smile, the brief hesitation in his posture. I excused myself early, claiming I needed to make a phone call. I didn't. I just needed space. Space to breathe. Space to collect the pieces of my fractured calm and convince myself they still fit. By noon, the sun had begun to press into the house with an almost oppressive intensity. I decided to go out for a walk, thinking the fresh air might help clear my head. I told my husband I'd be back soon and left before he could ask where I was going. I walked with no destination in mind, just a need to move, to escape the walls that seemed to be closing in. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the sidewalk beneath my feet felt steadier than my thoughts. I tried to focus on the ordinary, the rustle of leaves, the occasional bird call, the sound of a sprinkler sputtering to life on someone's lawn, but everything was underscored by the memory of that kiss. That one moment that had split something wide open in me. I found myself near the edge of town, in a quiet spot I hadn't visited in years. There was a bench under a white oak tree, weathered and worn, but still sturdy. I sat down, let the silence wash over me. For a while, I just breathed. I thought about the woman I had been 10 years ago, 5 years ago, last year. I thought about how I had slowly let pieces of myself slip away in service of comfort, of stability, of routine. I thought about how easy it had been to forget I was a person who once dreamed, desired, felt deeply. I didn't know what I wanted anymore. I didn't know what I was doing. But I knew I couldn't go back to pretending that everything was fine, that I was fine. By the time I returned home, the light had begun to soften. My husband was in the backyard, trimming the hedges, his back to me. Noah wasn't in sight. I slipped into the house quietly and went upstairs, hoping the silence would hold. Later that evening, I found myself in the kitchen again, hands busy preparing dinner. I was slicing vegetables when I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't turn. I knew who it was. I could feel his presence before he even entered the room. "I'm leaving," Noah said quietly. The knife paused in my hand. My grip tightened slightly. I didn't look at him. "When?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. "Tomorrow." I got the call. "They need me back." There was a long silence after that. I resumed chopping, slower this time, more deliberate. I didn't trust myself to speak. He waited, but I didn't turn to face him. I couldn't. There was too much unsaid, and I didn't know how to begin unraveling any of it. "I didn't want it to be like this," he said finally. "I didn't mean to make things complicated." I almost laughed, but it caught in my throat. Complicated didn't even begin to describe it. But what could I say? That he had reminded me of a part of myself I thought was dead? That I didn't blame him, but I didn't know how to forgive myself either? That I didn't want him to go, but also didn't know how to ask him to stay? "I know," I said, my voice low. Then he left the kitchen, and I was alone again. Dinner passed in relative quiet. My husband talked about the yard work, a neighbor's dog, a new show someone had recommended. I nodded along, asked questions, smiled in all the right places. I kept thinking about how well I could pretend. How well I had learned to. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed long after my husband had fallen asleep. I watched the moonlight filter in through the blinds, casting pale lines across the carpet. Everything looked soft, peaceful. But inside, I was anything but. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just sat there, staring at the floor, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. Noah was leaving. And with him, whatever had stirred in me, whatever piece of myself he had awakened, would leave too. I knew that. And yet, the thought of going back to how things were before, to the silence, the distance, the numbness, felt unbearable. But what choice did I have? I had made my life. I had built it piece by piece. And now, one misplaced step had shaken the foundation. And I didn't know if I could put it back together again. The morning Noah left was the kind of morning that felt like an end, but also a beginning. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. There was something about the absence of his presence that felt like a breath of fresh air, but at the same time, it was suffocating. I had wanted him gone, hadn't I? I had told myself that his departure would solve everything. That I could go back to the life I had built with my husband, that I could return to the comfortable routine I had spent years creating. And yet, there I was, standing in the doorway, watching him pack his bags in the guest room, feeling a weight pressing down on my chest. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? Goodbye felt like an understatement, and I'll miss you felt like a lie. Everything I felt was too complicated to put into words. So, instead, I just watched him, silently, as he zipped up his suitcase and glanced at me with that same steady gaze he had given me countless times over the past few days. It was the kind of look that made me feel seen in a way I had never been seen before, and it made the space between us seem wider than it had ever been. He finished packing and stood by the door, his hand resting on the handle. He wasn't in a rush. He wasn't trying to escape, not yet. But the moment felt final, like the closing of a chapter that had been written in too many unspoken words. I guess this is it, he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. I nodded, even though I didn't know what I was agreeing to. I didn't know what I was feeling. My throat was tight, and I found it hard to breathe. I wanted to tell him to stay, to make things right, but I couldn't. The truth was, I didn't know if I could handle any more of the confusion he had brought with him. The emotions, the guilt, the longing, it was all too much. You'll be all right, he added, as if reading my mind, his voice gentle but firm. I didn't respond. Instead, I stepped aside, making room for him to leave, to walk out of my life. My heart felt heavy, but my mind felt empty. I couldn't think of what to say, what to feel, or how to make sense of the whirlwind he had left in his wake. As he stepped outside, I stood in the doorway, watching him get into the car, start the engine, and drive away. I stood there for a long time, long after his car had disappeared from sight. I didn't know how long it took for me to move, but eventually, I turned back inside, back to the house that felt like a stranger's home now. The silence that followed was deafening. The house felt too big, too empty, too quiet. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock in the living room, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of the floorboards under my feet. Everything felt still, as if the world had paused, waiting for me to make a decision, any decision, about what came next. I walked slowly through the house, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't organize, couldn't understand. I went to the kitchen, opened the cupboard, and stared at the rows of mugs. My hand hovered over one, but I didn't pick it up. I wasn't thirsty. I wasn't hungry. I wasn't anything. I was just waiting. I wanted to move, to do something, anything, but I couldn't bring myself to. I didn't know where to start. I didn't know how to begin the process of picking up the pieces of my life. The hours dragged on. My husband didn't return until late in the afternoon. By then, I had managed to push most of the feelings aside, bury them under the routine of cleaning and tidying. I made dinner, as usual. I didn't talk much. Neither did he. He asked about my day, but I simply replied that it had been fine, that I had kept busy. He didn't press for details, and I didn't offer any. The evening passed in the same quiet way. The television hummed in the background, a familiar sound that had once felt like comfort, but now felt distant. My husband and I exchanged pleasantries, but the space between us was palpable, the silence heavier than usual. I could tell he was tired. He'd had a long day. But I wasn't tired. I was restless, full of emotions I didn't know how to express. I watched him move through the evening with the same ease he always did, but it felt like he was someone else, a man I no longer knew, or maybe one I had never truly known. When the night came and we both went to bed, I lay there beside him, unable to sleep. I could feel his presence beside me, but it didn't bring me comfort. I didn't know how to reach out to him, didn't know how to make the space between us smaller. I couldn't shake the image of Noah, his face, his smile, the way he had made me feel. I couldn't unfeel the connection I had shared with him, the way he had seen me when no one else had. I turned on my side, away from my husband, and stared at the darkened room. The quiet was suffocating. It wasn't that I didn't love my husband. It wasn't that I didn't care for him. But somewhere along the way, we had stopped being what we used to be. We had become two people living parallel lives, side by side, but never really connecting. The silence between us felt too loud. It was impossible to ignore. And as I lay there, staring into the dark, I realized something. The biggest lie I had been telling myself wasn't that I didn't care about my husband. It was that I could go on pretending everything was fine when, deep down, I knew it wasn't. I had been lying to myself for too long, ignoring the things that had slowly, quietly eroded the foundation of my marriage. But now, with Noah gone and my husband beside me, I knew I had to face the truth. I couldn't pretend anymore. I had to choose. The days that followed Noah's departure felt like something out of a dream, hazy, disconnected, as though I were moving through life without truly living it. The house was quieter, emptier. My husband moved through our home with the same familiar ease, but there was a subtle change in the air. I couldn't quite name it, but it was there, a shift, like a crack in a foundation that, for now, still held. I found myself constantly busying my hands, cleaning, organizing, cooking, anything to fill the silence. When I wasn't working, I kept my head down, avoiding my husband's gaze when I could, because every time I looked at him, I saw the things I hadn't said. Every time I heard him speak, I felt the space between us, growing larger with every word left unsaid. I could hear the clock ticking in the background, marking time that was moving forward even as I felt trapped in place. One evening, after dinner, my husband sat down with a drink in hand, the television on but mostly ignored. He stretched his legs out, leaned back into the couch, and for the first time in days, looked at me with a kind of weary expression I hadn't seen in years. "You've been quiet lately," he said softly, almost as if it were an observation, not a question. I looked up at him, a little startled by the suddenness of it. He had noticed. I didn't know if that made it better or worse. "I'm fine," I said, my voice flat. I wasn't fine, but I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't know how to begin to describe the tangle of emotions that knotted up inside me. He nodded, taking another sip of his drink, then placed it down on the side table. "I don't know what's going on with us anymore," he said, his voice softer now, almost like he was speaking to himself. It was the kind of thing we both knew, but never said aloud. The unspoken truth between us. Our marriage, this life we had built together, had been drifting for a long time, and I had been too afraid to face it. I was afraid of the implications of admitting it, of what it might mean. So I said nothing, and we let it slide. We let silence become the default. The house, despite its size, felt too small now. Our conversations were reduced to mundane exchanges, small talk about groceries or the weather, the same topics we had discussed 1,000 times before. But behind the routine, something deeper had changed. I couldn't deny it anymore. It wasn't about Noah anymore. I had convinced myself for so long that what I felt for him was just a passing thing, something I could ignore, something that didn't matter. But the truth was, it wasn't about him at all. It was about me. It was about what I had allowed myself to become, what I had let myself forget, that I was a woman with desires, with needs, with feelings that weren't just tied to being a wife or a mother. And yet, here I was, standing in front of my husband, who I had once loved so fiercely, and I realized that I didn't know who I was anymore. I didn't know how to be the woman I was before. The woman who had dreams and passions, the one who had been seen and heard. I didn't respond to his words. Instead, I just sat there, frozen, staring at the empty space between us. It felt like we were both holding our breath, waiting for the other to say something that would break the silence, but neither of us did. That night, I lay in bed beside him, my back turned towards him, staring at the darkness. I could hear his steady breathing, the rise and fall of his chest, and I wondered how we had gotten here. How had we become strangers in the same bed? How had we become so comfortable with the silence? I couldn't sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about the choices I had made, the kiss with Noah, the way it had made me feel alive again, the way it had shattered something inside me. I knew it was a mistake, but it wasn't the mistake I was afraid of. What terrified me was what it had revealed about myself. That I was willing to risk everything for something that had nothing to do with anyone else but me. I turned over slowly, careful not to wake my husband, and for a moment, I just watched him sleep. His face was peaceful, relaxed. He looked the same as he always had, but to me, he felt like a stranger. A stranger I had built a life with, but a stranger nonetheless. I wanted to reach out and touch him, to try to reconnect, but something stopped me. I didn't know if it was fear or doubt, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not now. Not with all the things left unsaid between us. And so, I lay there in the dark, alone in my thoughts, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I didn't know what the right decision was anymore. But I did know one thing. I couldn't keep pretending. The next morning, I woke up early. I dressed quickly and quietly, not wanting to disturb my husband. He was still asleep, his face relaxed in a way he only looked in the mornings. I didn't want to face him yet. I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to admit everything to myself, let alone to him. I slipped out of the house, the cool morning air hitting me as soon as I stepped outside. I needed space. I needed to think. The silence in the house was becoming suffocating, and I needed to breathe again, to feel something other than the heaviness of my own thoughts. I walked for hours. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just needed to be somewhere else, anywhere but there, in that house with all the weight of my choices hanging over me. I thought about Noah. I thought about how he had made me feel, how, for a brief moment, I had felt seen, desired, alive. But I also knew that wasn't the answer. He wasn't the answer. The answer had to come from me. From what I wanted, what I needed, and what I was willing to do to make it right. As I walked, the sky began to shift, the clouds darkening and the air growing colder. I stopped for a moment and looked around. The world was still the same. The houses, the trees, the roads, everything was just as it had been before. But I wasn't the same. And neither was my marriage. I knew I couldn't go back to pretending. I knew I couldn't keep living a life where I wasn't truly seen, where I wasn't truly living. I had to make a choice. And it wasn't going to be easy. But it was the only choice I could make. I turned around and started heading back home, the weight in my chest not as heavy now, but still present. It was time to face what was coming. Time to face the truth, whatever it was. And I knew that whatever happened next, I had to be honest with myself. I had to stop running. When I walked through the front door, the house felt different. The air was thick with the silence I had tried so desperately to avoid. I hadn't realized how much I had needed that time outside, away from everything, away from my husband, away from the guilt, away from the overwhelming weight of choices I didn't know how to make. But now I was back. And I knew it was time. My husband was sitting at the kitchen table, his coffee mug in hand, his eyes distant, lost in thought. He didn't look up when I entered, his attention still fixed on whatever was happening in his mind. His movements were mechanical, like he was going through the motions of the day without truly engaging with any of it. I had noticed this more and more lately. He was here, physically, but it felt like he wasn't truly present anymore. And the hardest part was that I wasn't sure how much of that was his fault, and how much of it was mine. I stood by the door for a few moments, watching him. I wasn't sure how to begin the conversation I knew we needed to have. I hadn't planned on what to say. How could I? How could I explain the things I had felt, the things I had done? How could I explain to him that the quiet I had been living in wasn't just the product of our daily routine? That it was because I had stopped hearing him, and he had stopped hearing me? Finally, he looked up. His eyes searched mine, and I saw something there, something I hadn't seen in a while. It was like he was waiting for me to say something, to acknowledge the shift that had taken place between us. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft, almost uncertain. It was such a simple question, but it felt like the weight of everything between us hung on those 3 words. I stood there, frozen, unsure how to answer. I wasn't sure if I was okay. How could I be? I don't know, I said finally, my voice a whisper. I felt the lump in my throat and tried to swallow it down, but it didn't work. It was as if everything I had been holding back for so long was beginning to spill out, and I didn't know how to stop it. He set his mug down, his gaze never leaving me. "We need to talk," he said. I nodded slowly, unable to find the words. The truth was, I had been avoiding this conversation for so long. I had been afraid of it, afraid of what it would mean for both of us. But now, with everything that had happened, I knew it couldn't be avoided any longer. "I don't know what's been happening," he continued. "You've been different. I've been different. It's like we're both just here, but not really. And I don't want to keep going like this. I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not." I stood there, absorbing his words. They were true, and yet they felt like a heavy blow to my chest. He was right. We were both pretending. We had been for so long. We had stopped connecting in any real way. And I had allowed myself to get so lost in the quiet that I had stopped hearing the most important things, the things I needed to hear. "I know," I finally said. My voice was shaky now, but I couldn't stop it. The words were already coming, and they weren't going to be easy. "I've been pretending too. I've been living in this silence, this routine, and I've let it consume me. I stopped seeing us for what we were. I stopped seeing you. And I've been so afraid of what's happened between us that I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to face it." He didn't speak right away. Instead, he just looked at me, his expression unreadable. It was like he was waiting for me to say more, to offer some kind of explanation for everything. But I didn't know how to explain the emptiness that had settled in my chest, the longing I had felt for something that I couldn't even define. "I kissed him," I said, the words coming out in a rush before I could stop them. There. I had said it. I had said the one thing I had been terrified to admit. I had kissed Noah. And that one moment had changed everything. It had broken something inside me that I wasn't sure I could fix. For a long time, he didn't say anything. His face didn't change, but I saw the pain in his eyes. It was there, just beneath the surface, and it hurt me to see it. Because I knew that pain was mine. I had caused it. Why? He asked quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I closed my eyes, unable to answer him right away. How could I explain why? How could I explain the loneliness, the quiet yearning, the desire to be seen again, to feel something other than the weight of a life that had become too comfortable? How could I explain that in that moment, I had been desperate for something that wasn't just an obligation, that wasn't bound by time or responsibility? I don't know, I said finally, my voice cracking. I don't know why. It just happened. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't myself. And it was wrong. It was a mistake. But I couldn't stop it. He looked down at his hands, then back up at me. What does this mean for us? For our marriage? I took a deep breath. I had no answers. I couldn't promise him that things would go back to normal, that everything would be fixed. I couldn't even promise that I knew how to fix it. But I did know one thing. I couldn't live in this silence anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. I don't know, I said, my voice small now. But I want to try. I want to figure this out. I want to stop pretending. I want to stop living in this shadow. He stood up then, walking over to where I stood. For a moment, we just stood there, facing each other in the silence. It wasn't comfortable, but it was real. And that, in itself, felt like a step forward. I don't know if we can fix this, he said finally. But we have to try. We owe it to ourselves. I nodded, a small sob escaping my throat. I had no idea where this was going to lead, but I knew that for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the truth anymore. I wasn't afraid to face the mess, to face the broken pieces of us. We had to try. Even if I didn't know how. Even if I didn't know what would happen next. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was no longer pretending. The next few days felt like stepping into a strange, uncharted territory. Everything had changed, yet nothing was visibly different. My husband and I moved through the house as if we were still the same people, but beneath the surface, there was a tension we couldn't ignore. It was a silence, a kind of quiet understanding that something had to be addressed, but we were both unsure of where to start. I had opened a door that I couldn't close, and neither of us knew how to walk through it. We didn't talk much about what had happened. The kiss, the realization of what had been lost, and the years of silence we had been living in. It wasn't that we were avoiding it, not completely. But there was this strange space between us, like we were both standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to step forward or pull back. The truth hung between us like an invisible thread, fragile and delicate, waiting to snap. I found myself watching him more carefully than I had in years. He was still the man I had married, the man who had been my partner, my confidant, the father of our children. But there was a distance now, a subtle shift in the way I saw him. I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't even know if I could. It was as if I had woken up from a long sleep, only to realize that I had been living in a dream. And the dream was over. The house was quiet in the mornings. We ate breakfast together, but the conversations were shallow, casual. He would ask me about my plans for the day, and I would answer, my words automatic, devoid of the deeper connection we had once shared. I wanted to break the silence, but I didn't know how. I didn't know what to say. How do you begin the process of rebuilding something that feels broken beyond repair? One evening, after dinner, I found myself sitting alone in the living room. The television was on, but I wasn't watching it. My mind was elsewhere, turning over the same questions, the same doubts. What had happened to us? What had happened to me? I had spent so many years being a wife, a mother, a caretaker, that I had forgotten what it was like to be just me. To have desires, to have a life outside of the roles I had assumed. And now that I had felt a taste of it again, I wasn't sure I could go back to the way things were. My husband entered the room, his steps soft but deliberate. He stopped just inside the doorway, watching me for a moment before speaking. "Are you okay?" I turned toward him, surprised by the question. I wasn't sure how to answer. What was okay anymore? How could I be okay when everything felt so up in the air, so uncertain? "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what's happening. I don't know what to feel." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "I don't know either. But I think we need to figure it out. I can't keep pretending like nothing's wrong." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. We both knew that pretending wasn't working anymore. Pretending had gotten us here, to this point where we couldn't ignore the cracks in our relationship any longer. The silence between us had been filled with all the things we hadn't said, all the things we had kept hidden from each other for too long. "We can't keep living like this," he continued, his voice quieter now. "I don't want to lose you, but I don't know how to fix this." I felt a pang of guilt, sharp and sudden. I didn't want to lose him either. But I didn't know how to fix it either. How do you fix something that has been broken for so long, something that has festered quietly, unnoticed, until it's too late to go back? "I don't know how to fix it either," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "But I know I don't want to live like this anymore. I don't want to live in this silence, this nothing." He sat down beside me, his presence solid but distant, as if we were on opposite sides of an invisible divide. "What do we do then?" he asked, his voice low. I didn't have an answer. I wanted to say something, anything, to reassure him, to make him feel like we could fix it, like there was a way forward. But I couldn't. I didn't know how. The truth was, I wasn't sure where we stood anymore. I wasn't sure if I even knew who I was anymore, let alone who we were together. "I don't know," I said again, my voice shaking now. "I don't know what to do. I just know that I can't keep pretending. I can't keep ignoring everything that's wrong." He reached out, his hand brushing mine gently, as though he wasn't sure if I would pull away. I didn't. I didn't want to. But I was afraid of what it would mean to reach out, to open myself up again, to let him in when I wasn't sure where we stood. "I know," he said softly. "I know we've been living in this silence. But maybe we can start over. Maybe we can find a way back to each other." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that there was a way back, that we could rebuild what had been lost. But the truth was, I didn't know if we could. I didn't know if we could go back to the way things were, or if we even wanted to. "What if we can't?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What if this is the end? What if we've already gone too far?" His eyes darkened, the weight of my words sinking in. "I don't know," he said softly. "But I know that I'm not ready to give up. And I don't think you are either." The words hung in the air between us, fragile and uncertain. Neither of us knew what the future held, or if we could make it work. But in that moment, we both knew one thing: we couldn't go on pretending anymore. We couldn't go on living in this half-life, in this silence that had stretched on for so long. Whatever came next, we had to face it together, or we had to let it go. The night stretched on in quiet uncertainty. Neither of us had the answers, but we both knew that we had reached a turning point. What came next was anyone's guess. But we had to try. We had to try to be honest with ourselves, with each other, and with the life we had built. And maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to rebuild what had been broken. But for now, all we had was the silence. The silence that, for once, didn't feel like the end, but the beginning of something new.